G'day, my name's Jen Ford. I'm the Principal Restoration Ecologist at Ecosure, coming to you today from Turrbal, Yagara country. Thank you Port Macquarie-Hastings Regional Council for allowing me to share some of my knowledge so together we can better restore our natural areas. Today we're going to talk a little bit about restoration planning or developing an action plan for your site. So what's the point of doing that, you say? Well, it can actually save us a heap of time and money. And when there's a change of the guard, whether it's via council or people in council, or even as community shift over or contractors that have been helping with the restoration on the site, it really helps us all move in the same direction. Having something documented when things get challenging or you need to make a certain decision, it's really good to be able to consult the plan because it's something that we've all agreed on, we know where we're headed, we understand our aims and objectives, and we also understand how to measure those. So the elements of a site action plan, remember it's a document that brings us all together and moving in the same direction. So apart from the obvious site name and those kinds of things, what we want to have in there is our clear aims and objectives, now that we know what they are after our site assessment. What we also want to do is have a great description of our site and use that site and its features to break it up into workable zones. So for instance, use something physical on your site to demarcate that zone. It's not an arbitrary line on a map, it needs to be easily defined on site. So it might be, hey, a creek, it could be the pathway, it could be a massive fig, it could be a big fallen log, something that you know is not going to change too readily, and that might become the edge of your zone. So think about not millions of zones, because then it just gets way too confusing, but perhaps breaking your site into zones. Prioritising work needs to consider both the budget and the time frames, and the presence of things like declared weeds, the presence of weeds that might have long-term effects on the site. Perhaps they've got a really long seed viability, or perhaps they're really destructive, like fast-growing vines that are impacting not only the understory but the mid-story and the canopy. It might also be that there's flammable vegetation, like a heap of lantana, that is sitting perhaps on an ecotone between a sclerophyll system and a dry rainforest system. And we've really got to protect that dry rainforest system from fire. That might mean that we go in there and more immediately prioritise that area. Having access will also influence where we prioritise things, but regardless, it's a systematic and comprehensive approach to weed control that is absolutely essential, and it is where we are going to find our biggest successes as well as efficiencies of both finances and our own energy. On this site, where we've been looking at a 17 hectare area, we've broken that into about 6 zones. So the teams know where to work to, both primary work, follow-up work and maintenance, and once everything is at a manageable level, they then move on to the next zone, zone 2. Once that's been worked, while still maintaining zone 1, they consolidate as one and then move on to zone 3. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a description of our site, a description of our zones, and then we're going to clearly mark down in dot points what we're going to do on site. So for instance, it might be to cut, scrape and paint the lantana. It might be to hand weed the mistflower along the creek, knowing that we can perhaps more safely spot spray away from that water's edge. It's got the actions that we need to do. It might also talk about monitoring. So where are we going to put our monitoring photo points? Look out for video 3. And how are we going to monitor? When are we going to monitor? So everything that we need to do for that zone and for that site so that we reach full recovery, that's what's going to go into our plan. Not only that, we're going to have some really wonderful backup information. So perhaps a set of appendices. It might have how to control all your weeds. It might have all the rates of control for all of those weeds, for all the different techniques. And it might also have a planting list and the specifications around planting. All of these elements need to go into our plan. So we understand A, if we're reaching our aims and objectives, and B, how we're going to monitor it and understand, are we going to get there? There are a number of different approaches to ecological restoration. So by analysing our site, we can better understand how and when to intervene and what the best approach to restoration is. For instance, if a site's in really good condition and maybe we fence the cows out and there's no more impacts and, well, the site can recover of its own accord, that's what we tend to call natural regeneration. That's one. The second one is a bit more complex. It's assisted regeneration. So it's often when our sites still have capacity to recover, they're covered in weed, and let's face it, that's a pretty familiar scene that many of us are facing. But we've deemed that we think there's still a good soil seed bank and there's still capacity for recovery by perhaps seed and propagules still coming onto our site. Maybe stuff's coming down this creek right now. The third one is, well, maybe the site is so compacted or it's eroded or there's been big issues on there and the resilience is really depleted. That's when we're going to have to reconstruct it. Some people use the term revegetate, so planting. Hot tip though, sometimes we don't need to plant, and sometimes it's really good to just wait a year or two and see what happens. Then we can plant anyway, and we'll still know our site even better than we did when we first started. And the fourth approach is fabrication, or we can call it rehabilitation. So perhaps the area has been mined and it no longer has its natural soil profile, or perhaps it's a wetland that's been filled in. Doesn't mean that site cannot have good values reinstated, but we are going to have to reconstruct it fully. And some of our areas need both assisted regeneration and a bit of reconstruction. This area used to be all weed, lots of lantana, ochre, morning glory, mistflower, so many different weeds. And most of it, as you can see, has come back beautifully, but not this little patch. This continually gets scoured by high flood events. So the only way that we can do here, I don't really reckon we've got much of a seed bank here, but is to probably plant it, get some stability in, get some structure back, and nature will take care of the rest.